We could get started with some music. Gosh, there's lots of river songs. The River Gets Wide, I can think of. Lots of ocean songs, lots of Jimmy Buffett. But let's just get through this thing. How about that? Let's try to make this one a little shorter than the last couple have been. All right, let's start with the aquatic biomes and how we divide them up. We divide them up really based on three significant factors, the most of which is water flow. So when you think of water systems, you should think of streams and rivers as one. You should think of lakes and ponds as another. And you should think of oceans as a third. But when we talk about aquatic biomes, we also have to talk about how much salt is in the water. That's called salinity. You know, there are some rivers and streams that we consider fresh water, but there's a little bit of salinity in them. Of course, the oceans have plenty of salinity. We also have to talk about depth, because if we're going to talk about biomes, we have to talk about the different plant life and animal life that exists in each biome, and that's controlled a great deal by how deep the water is. So these are the three factors that we categorize water biomes by. Let's start with the first one, streams and rivers. There's a scientific term for streams and rivers, and that is lotic. Streams and rivers are considered lotic, and the way I remember that word is because they flow, and there's a low in lotic. So flowing waters are considered lotic. Now when you think of streams and rivers, don't forget that there are other flowing waters besides streams and rivers. Our underground springs are flowing water. When there's runoff, either from a rainstorm or from melting snow, that runoff is flowing as well. It's not moving very quickly. It's moving awfully slow, as a matter of fact, but it is moving water. It is lotic. One of the things they talk about in the book is the idea of rapids, and they are important because of hydroelectric power. You know, when you picture a river, picture its origination being from up in the mountains, because most all rivers have their source up in the mountains. The winter snows melt, and that melting water channels down the side of a mountain. It goes through all of these different little channels and everything, and that moving water is really moving fast up in the mountains. So those are fast moving rivers, fast moving streams, and there's a lot of waterfall activity there. And that's why the rapids are always up in the mountains. The rapids are in places where there's a steep drop off. Maybe it's not a waterfall, but there's enough fast movement that it forms rapids. So those rapids are important because the faster the water's moving, the more power we can get out of it in terms of something like hydroelectric power. And I think in the book they have a nice picture of a flowing stream. So that is going to have different animal life and plant life than water that's standing still, for the obvious reasons. Some aquatic species need that moving water in order to survive. Others would much prefer in standing water, like a lake. And that's all I want to say about streams and rivers. Just remember, picture a river originating in the mountains, small channels, fast moving water when they're up in the mountains, but as the water flows out of the mountain and it gets down into flatter lands, the rivers typically flatten out, they get wider, and the water movement slows considerably. Alright, lots of terms for you to remember when it comes to the lakes and the ponds. This is what we call standing water, right? It's not moving. And the science term for water that stands still is lentic. The opposite of lotic is lentic. One of the big things for us to remember about lakes and ponds is the presence of phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are unicellular organisms that do photosynthesis. See phyto in front of this word. Phyto means plant. So phytoplankton are plankton that act like plants. They are not plants, right? Plant kingdom contains only multicellular organisms. So phytoplankton is plant-like plankton, and it's plant-like because it does photosynthesis. It's a producer. Well, this phytoplankton sits on the surface of almost all lakes and ponds and just sits there doing its reproductive thing. And as long as it's reproducing, it's also photosynthesizing. That is putting the oxygen into the water, and oxygen levels are very, very important in water. When it comes to the streams and the rivers, that oxygen is being added because of the flow of the water. All right, these other terms here, I'm going to show you a diagram, and you're just going to have to memorize what these terms are. This diagram, by the way, is in your book. Remind me to show you this video about phytoplankton and their importance in the food web in class tomorrow. Please remind me. All right, so here's the diagram. Here's a beautiful lake in the Adirondacks. Beautiful blue lake. It's standing water. There's photosynthesis happening on the surface in the form of phytoplankton, and you can just imagine all of the other living things that love to hang out in lakes and ponds. All right, let's get to the terminology. First, you need to learn this word, littoral, sometimes pronounced littoral, but that sounds too much like the other word, literal, which means, you know, exact word, the literal translation. So I'll call it littoral. It'll help you remember. The littoral area is the coastline. Of course, this isn't a coast because this isn't an ocean, but it is that area where the lake and the land meet. It's called the littoral zone. So the banks of the lake is the littoral zone, and of course, this is an ecotone, isn't it? So you're going to have organisms that can live in the lake right along the littoral zone. You're also going to have plant life and other animals that live right along the shoreline here, and they also are in the littoral zone. The limnetic zone is the area that's a little bit deeper. It goes down, it's not on the surface, but goes down, and it's kind of the mid-level. The mid-level area is the limnetic zone, and this is where you're going to find most of the fish that swim around and stuff like that are in the limnetic zone. The benthic zone is the deep, deep water, the deep area. In fact, it's really the muddy bottom. So the profundal zone, I wish this label was really up here, because the profundal zone is the deep water. All right, so let's get it right. The littoral zone is the shoreline. The limnetic zone is down a little bit deeper, the midsection of the lake, and the bottom layer of the water is called the profundal zone. So there's going to be less fish, there's less NPP in the profundal zone, so there's going to be less fish in this region than there are up in the limnetic zone. And then the very, very muddy bottom is called the benthic zone. Of course, there's a lot of decomposers that live in the benthic zone. Included in lakes and ponds, and as far as standing water concerned, is wetlands. So let's go through some of the most common ecosystems that are wetlands. Now, wetlands get their name really because they vary in whether or not the area is completely underwater. So when there's wetlands, there are some areas that are not underwater all the time. Maybe the tides will. When the tide comes in, the land is underwater. When the tide goes out, it's dry land. Well, that's considered a wetland. And I wanted to teach you the difference between swamps and marshes, just for your information. Marshes are more like grasslands. Okay, so marshes have plenty of grasses, no trees. In fact, that's the big difference. Swamps have trees. Swamps have trees in them. So there is a difference between swamps and trees. Get it? You need to understand what the differences are. Of course, we use the terms interchangeably in everyday life, and certainly these guys that are on the TV shows like Swamp People, they're really doing a lot of their work in marshes. It's not even a swamp. So it's a swamp if there's plenty of trees. This other wetland I want to spend a few minutes on is called a bog. You may have heard that term before. Bogs are wetlands that are very, very spongy. And bogs are full of plant life, especially mosses. And so that's really where bogs differ from these other two. Bogs are miles and miles and miles of nothing but moss growth. You know, the green, spongy moss growth. And over the thousands of years, even millions of years, different layers of these mosses grow on top of each other. And so they build on top of each other. And over millions of years, the bottom layer of the bog, which was once moss on the surface, is now way down deep, and it's gone through some considerable decomposition and some considerable pressure to make the moss area at the bottom of the bog usable as a non-renewable resource. So in places where there's not a lot of oil and coal, for instance, the British Isles, they have a lot of bogs, and they will literally cut into their bogs big chunks of dirt with moss all dead inside and burn it, because it burns pretty good. It doesn't burn as good as oil or coal, but it's what they have, and they will literally mine their bogs and use that millions of years dead moss to burn, to boil the water, to make the steam that turns the turbine, that turns a ball of wire inside a magnet. So that's what a bog is. Bogs are an interesting ecosystem. They're not everywhere. Like I said, the British Isles, I actually walked in a bog in upstate New York. It's pretty cool because when you walk on it, you feel like you're walking on air. Because of all of that moss, all of those centuries on top of each other, it's very spongy. And you almost feel like you're going to fall in. You almost feel like you're walking and there's going to be quicksand, that you're just going to start sinking and sinking. But you don't. You sink in a little bit, you get that spongy feeling, but you don't actually sink in very far. Okay, what else do we need to talk about when it comes to our wetlands? Well, there's different types of wetlands besides the swamps and the marshes. You have these pictures in your book, and you can see what I'm talking about here. First, we have A is a swamp, and like I said, swamps are wetlands that have lots of trees in them. Marshes are wetlands that are really grassy areas. And then this picture here, C, is of a bog. Now you can see here the water is completely kind of overrun that area there. So the boggy area is this land area here. Like I said, very spongy to walk on, and it's mosses. Okay, so let me end that video there with the bogs, and we'll get into a whole bunch of other grassy water areas called wetlands. And then also, after that, we will get into the coral reef and the open ocean. So that'll be the next video coming up. That's it for now. Nice and short, just like I promised.